Yeah, the reason why, when I touched on Christianity and the Catholicism sort of issue, why I can't say Christianity was such a positive force for the for Western civilization in some sense is because it was corrupted quite badly by Catholicism. That there are things in it that are positive, but that doctrine essentially I don't think ever became the mainstay of Catholicism in some sense. Catholicism was always a kind of bastardized version of Christianity. Um, but I mean, perhaps superficially it has some aspects, but it's more. It's exactly what I said. It's not the fact that Christianity suppressed the proliferation of borderline values and manipulation and envy filtering, but at least it was part of a canonical story, um, of an overriding narrative that drowned out all the competitors, and it was good at being consistent and being the same one. So it was part of the 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 general displacement of all others in some sense, and that sort of quieted the seas. It didn't resolve the issue of the tumultuous aspect that the sea is just a flabby mass of saline, you know, water that you can't drink, and if you do anything to it, it just sort of creates turbulence in equal and opposite direction. It sort of everything cancels itself out. It just, the troughs and crests. It just transmits force from it doesn't have a real character of its own, but at least it quieted the seas, as it were. Um, and then it also made people, in the quietness of that, it gave people the open, the calmness of thought to ponder what disturbs the seas. And although they couldn't necessarily turn that so much onto the Catholicism orthodoxy itself, they could at least use that calmness to identify the types and stripes of pathological, sort of things. I mean, that's not to say that Western Europe is not prone to, or Western civilization is not prone to bitter conflict and warfare and ideological, you know, subversion and subterfuge, and that it doesn't have. But in some sense, it has done better than other cultures at suppressing borderline pollution, as it were, um, and proliferation, and keeping a hold on it. Although those mechanisms have now, I think, although culturally they still exist in some form, um, there's obviously a great effort to breed them out of existence, essentially, to indoctrinate the next generation and to stop them from establishing enough sanity and clarity of thought to think that there's even an alternative to the borderline fascistic way of conceiving of society and such. Anyway, damn, I wanted to say something completely different. I just wanted to touch on that and then move on. The other topic that I wanted to bring up was okay. Now I just remember I wanted to describe narcissism, uh, kind of with reference to what I've said about histrionic and borderline, because I've gone into it, I think, quite detailed in a quite nicely sort of detailed way. I wanted to give narcissism a sort of similar treatment in relation to the things that I spoke about the other disorders. But I just want to finish that idea now about Christianity, though, because I mean it is slightly more complicated than that. Because obviously, Christianity being a kind of personal faith as well, not just being a social imposition that Catholicism was imposing on society, but also had an interpersonal dimension. Again, even though I wouldn't consider that the actual Christian doctrine, that it was still a perversion in some sense, it still served as part of that function, as I was describing, that at least it was displacing the personal borderline. So it wasn't just that it stopped borderlines from infecting uh, the political economy, as it were, or the cultural social consciousness, but it also impeded individuals from certain forms of extravagant um, extensions of their borderline values in some sense. In that, well, not entirely, I would say, but at least within certain excesses, people weren't able to sort of um, create their own, at least, religion. They couldn't create their own borderline subculture cult, as it were. They couldn't cross over the line into the religious terrain. So there was some, which is essentially what can be facilitated if you allow people to indulge into folklore. And I mean, you can see the explosion of Wicca and paganism. I'm not speaking out against anything like that. People have the liberal freedom to do that, but you just understand that, like, saying that people have the liberal freedom to do that, in some sense, that requires a kind of liberal structure and a sort of liberal political consciousness. And if everyone goes into that kind of stuff, then, if they really give themselves over to it and they don't sort of, it's that kind of belief system is quite commensurate with developing, it's kind of a kind of toxic perennialism that says, well, now it's actually time for us to become an authoritarian, political culture, and everything should be in the image of this, um, that the liberal structure, in some sense, at least archetypally, to some degree, was in a primordial form in terms of Catholicism, merely by the fact that it was displacing that which would make it impossible to have a liberal sort of environment, which I guess, obviously didn't even, it took European society thousands of years, or throughout the course of 1,000 years, to sort of develop into that. Even it's not like Catholicism made that obvious from the start. It grew from the silence that Catholicism imposed, as it were, on the quiet and calm that it imposed. Okay, this is a complicated sort of cultural psychosocial thing. I've treated it in more detail in other recordings, so let me just move on to narcissism. So I'm starting to sort of speculate with a certain idea that, in some sense, narcissism has something like a pure narcissist has something that is similar enough to the envy filter, but it's nothing like the envy filter. And in some sense, it exists purely within the inner child itself. It exists within the narcissist's unconscious side of the mind, which obviously for it is not unconscious. And so the narcissist is actually a curator of their own beliefs, but they also hold their own beliefs, I think, at some distance, because they can sort of toy with them within some parameters. Within some subsets of their belief, they can create fictions to themselves, and that's fine, because they've got only one set of sacrosanct beliefs, which are like their solipsistic constitution. And in some sense, I believe that they construct within their inner child a kind of inverse subconscious, where it's like it does the same thing that a subconscious would do for other people, but they do it within a kind of contemplative emulation from a set of beliefs that that they're okay to toy with, and revise and edit, and be fast and loose with, or can articulate. And so they can almost do some things that are similar in terms of the in the way that the envy filter of a borderline can create a kind of sympathetic cultural web, uh, um, or a web of cultural, sympathetic intellectual sympathizing, can create a web of intellectual sympathizing that conforms to the rudiment of using that envy filter, um, as the conduit between their inner child and the subconscious of others. Um, a narcissist will have a kind of internal playground, an internal sandbox, where they are building structures which, they can toy with them to some degree, but they've maybe got some snapshots in there about which contemplative sandbox iterations are stable and sort of have a kind of consistency. And in some sense, it's almost like the inverse of the envy filter, because it's not they're not connecting with something on the outside. They are only tracking things that have been monitored and modeled in terms of their belief, and they are the king of their own, of curating their own beliefs in some sense. And in some sense, the only way that you can harm a narcissist, and in some indirect sense, narcissists are more vulnerable in this sense, because borderlines can compartmentalize between the external and the internal, and then they can keep their internal bullshit insulated. Whereas a narcissist, in some sense, if you are in a narcissist's inverted, if you're being plotted within a narcissist's inverted subconscious, as it were, uh, you can potentially get your hands on objects, on mental objects that the narcissist is tracking and monitoring within their conception of things, and you can essentially move those objects around and essentially cause the narcissist a kind of internal dissonance in terms of their beliefs, in terms of the sandbox. You can sort of use the sandbox, you can reorientate the sandbox because they have some vision on you. And if you can track how they have vision on you, and if you can sort of reverse engineer the kind of emulation, the kind of matrix that they are conjuring in their inverted subconscious, in their unconscious sandbox, or the inner child sandbox, then you can signal to them greater metaphysical truths, as it were, by um, by playing with their toys and doing things with their toys, with their sandbox, that they didn't think were possible, that sort of break their mold in some sense, that break the construct of the sandbox itself, and that reach from the sandbox deeper into the other parts of the belief structures of the narcissist. As I say, I think that they have a kind of sacrosanct constitution which gives them the power, essentially, to gives them, well, it's double edged in some sense. It gives them the power to create this inverted subconscious, and also at the same time to essentially stop them from ever relating to something that's actually subconscious, that sort of is a kind of like an autistic um, seal that contains their seat of consciousness from ever venturing beyond the inner child. And there's at least some level of self-deception around that. There's some level of internal belief, justification, and necessitating and sympathizing. Um, and obviously, these sandboxes are so engaging themselves that they have all the complexities that other people have, but they have them from the perspective of the architect. They are always the architect of the scenario, and therefore, obviously, it can be difficult for them, because if they are getting too dislocated from their ability to handle it, the control of the sandbox, then they will want to sort of destroy all the structures and make new ones or something like that, and they'll confabulate, and they will sort of try to teleport themselves to a new sandbox, so that they can almost do a lot of things like pushing the reset button, but in a completely sort of different form, and it takes on a different sort of character, because they're not doing this with crying. They're doing this just usually with raw anger and shouting and sort of narcissistic rage. And but I mean, I guess they can also create, you know, quite usually one-dimensional and stupid justifications of their actions, or excusing themselves, or and usually it's like, you know, they will just kind of make a narrative. You know, so there are parallels with that and borderline, but I believe that it's happening all contained within the inner child. They essentially don't have a real subconscious. Some way that's almost a metaphorical construct that you can try to understand their internal mechanics. Okay, so I probably almost suggested that I was going to give more treatment to it than that. In some sense, the narcissist is cursed because they are fundamentally a simpler creature with less moving parts, but they are trying to mimic the same kind of sophistication to some degree as the borderline, but they have less material to work with. And that simplicity in terms of the medium that they have to work with also makes it more sophisticated in terms of their self-inception, in terms of their own belief structure. So there's a kind of cognitive dissonance which is running on overtime, which borderlines, in some sense, although borderlines have dissonance, it's one big self-deception, whereas with the narcissist it's much more convoluted. I wanted to make another point as well, which I wanted to add on to the last recording, which I was actually didn't remember properly to bring up, which was now slipping my mind again. Something about the medium of dishonesty. What was it? Damn it! No, okay, it slipped my mind. Let me just describe that one aspect better than I just did, I guess, is that when I said that the borderline has got one big self-deception, that's like sort of when they are transferring the greed into the envy filter, which then they kind of, you know, they can have a kind of moral certainty, because that envy filter in some sense is like the moral cloud that they're imposing on their victim or their host, or their codependent, you know, sort of structure that they're trying to house that envy filter in some sense, um, which is this kind of systemic deception that needs to be protected and concealed and secured and made safe because everyone is actually like that or something like that. You know, that's the kind of justification. Um, yeah, so in some sense, it's weird. The borderline is kind of like a half-life narcissist that they kind of have both things going. They have a belief structure in a child that gives them the permission to create this envy filter, and in some sense, you know, because I mean, this the obviously the borderline doesn't have their own subconscious. They are just looking for someone else to have a subconscious that they can control a certain way that can correspond to how they like to um, interchange their envy filter into reactions, into consequences, which they can direct, with somebody else being accountable for how those consequences are delivered, essentially. Uh, which, in some sense, is kind of what a narcissist is doing, in some vague sense, but the narcissist, in some sense, actually has to care about the nitty gritty, actually has to care about the internal mechanics of all the beliefs, in some sense. And so, narcissists, in some sense, know that they're not the same as other people, but they also know that, or they believe that they are superior because essentially they're the only things. They are actual solipsists. They believe that they are the only mind in the universe that can think on that level, that can see beneath the coding of the emotional matrix or something like that, and they never enter the matrix because that's for the deluded, that's for the deranged, and essentially they are the only architect, they are the sole architect, as it were. Um, in some sense, a borderline is a narcissist that actually isn't a solipsist. They don't actually believe that they are the only mind. They just believe that they deserve to enslave all other minds. So they're kind of like they believe that there should be a one-way transaction, a one-way filter between them and other minds, and that they should have a kind of subjective domain. So they like in some sense they are narcissists, as well as having this way of treating other people. They have a patterned culture of treating other people's subconsciouses a certain way, and then histrionics are exactly the same as that. Just they become unconscious about it. In some sense, a histrionic is a borderline that grew up a bit too much, and then they actually developed their ego function to some extent, and because they developed their ego function to some degree, that created a kind of unconscious borderline, uh, uh, a suppressed and unconscious borderline starting point. That's a bit of a metaphor, but yeah. You know, they grew up too much, um, and they gave too much. They gave actual relevance to the subconscious domain, and they worked out that essentially they could extend their control better being a participant, because essentially, I guess maybe, I mean, look, there could be many different reasons why the kind of the borderline kernel became histrionic, but in some sense it's because the idea was is that you can feed your internal greed by actually playing the game and risking, and actually joining the game and risking losing. The borderline is like playing a game that they have no risk of losing, and the histrionic has actually just said that, okay, actually I don't mind playing to win and risking that I can be a loser. So they actually give themselves over to the kind of the cultural mass, the collective cultural, zeitgeist or whatever. They'll like, yes, I'll let that be the arbiter. They let somebody else be the judge of it, whereas the borderline keeps the judge in the inner child in some sense, whereas the histrionic actually allows some kind of strange fudged ego judgment of like, okay, well, popularity will be something like high status popularity, or high expert popularity, or expert credentials, or authority. It's they'll have some they'll create some god figure out of some kind of rationality or something. They'll elect a an epistemic conducive uh, sort of idolatry that they can then center and ground themselves to orient. So essentially, they become stable. They become stably codependent with an idolatry that is plugged into reality, some facet of external reality, and so they use that to export the seat of consciousness from their inner child, and then their inner child obviously then becomes unconscious because of that export. Whereas the narcissist doesn't do any of this stuff. In some sense, they have a weird kind of simulated subconscious within their own belief, but strewn and framed by the tenets of their own belief structure or whatever, within some subset of their beliefs, of things that it's okay to toy with and experiment with, and to sort of create models of prediction and to pervade over. And in some sense it's arbitrary what models they create and what models they want to to use to verify their overarching um, mastery and confirmation of their insulation. Because in some sense, the only thing that they have to keep on reaffirming is whatever part of their belief involves their self-image disowning the external subconscious, or disowning their own emotions, because that's the same thing. The one is the model of the other. So, sort of relegating emotions as to only attaching to the internally modeled sandboxes in some sense. So it's sort of like the captivation of the inverse subconscious, which is a belief machine as a subset within the constitution of the narcissist's inner child. Okay, so I'm being very vague in some sense, that I'm not outlining exactly what the example of the kind of the ontology would be exactly. My metagram system would probably give some clues. Or perhaps metatype rather, actually, to. Well, metagram and metatype together would probably might be able to give some better, clearer outline of reverse engineering. It's interesting. I wonder, since what I've said before about metagram, if I mean, it's probably true that certain metagram types will manifest concretely as particular sets of disorders that will either be a combination of certain comorbidities, or it'll be a certain spectrum within a certain preset sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, yeah, that would, I need to start diagnosing people in terms of, or I can't say that word legally, but I need to start um, typing people and then asking them, and then I guess getting what their diagnosis is in terms of personality disorder, and seeing if there's a consistency between that. Because that at least, because then I would be able to probably get very close to reverse engineering, or even just creating very useful archetypes in terms of my metagram typology, in terms of like what that circuit is emblematic of on the ontological aspect of the development of that particular false ego. Okay, anyway, and essentially how that circuit of that metagram structure is symbolic of a particular kind of decision that was made, that that inculcated a self-image, a self-portrait, that manifested as that species of false ego. Anyway, that's about it, I guess. I think I've done this topic to death, pretty much. It is interesting how a lot of these disorders are almost metaphors for the other ones, in varying degrees of analysis and obviously turning them into symbolic constructs for the others. So it's never very precise, but it's interesting that in some sense the narcissist is very self-satisfied, is very empowered in some, at least it has the potential to exude that and to enjoy that sense of himself or herself. And that kind of narcissistic power play is, although it has to be maintained by a kind of vigorous, convoluted calibration of these sandboxes and things like that, and getting into sort of a minutiae, of obsessiveness in some sense, which in some sense undermines that the simplicity of the narcissist in some sense. It's possible to trap the narcissist into a kind of to enforce him to sort of follow some kind of rationalistic formula in order to preserve his own structures to some degree, if he has already sort of decided that he wouldn't just sort of pack them in, and he can't find an easy way to kind of quickly collapse them and to sort of create a more weaselly or slimy or sort of convoluted way of continuing the kind of passing forward the buck in terms of avoiding the dissonance or the hurt of the dissonance or something like that. Um, or and sometimes I guess the narcissist also literally, after they have realized that their whole contemplative system is not the only one possible, in some sense, that that there's a part of development which they kind of skipped out on. This perhaps happens over a lot of experience, over a lot of time. They reach the understanding, in some sense, that there is an aspect in psychological reality which they have completely, they have such limited access to, and they've completely missed out on. And then you can kind of get the kind of self-pitying narcissist that is that wants to mortify themselves so that they can at least try get glimpses of a kind of ego function, and they can almost they can try to recycle their whole inner child in some sense. And when I say recycle, I mean not as in the recycling bin. I mean like in the sense that the whole thing gets revivified, that the whole false ego complex um, re-stimulates itself, and that the circuitry makes a full loop. It makes a full circle, um, and that gives them an aspect to kind of for a brief moment to try to sort of find at least it can be hoped that you can use that mechanic in some sense to import a new mystery machine that you can get inside of the inner child, because you're trying to steal something from the heavens, from the ego function, and try to get it to sort of work the magic in the super ego and precipitate a new object to be delivered to you in your sandbox as a narcissist. Um, anyway, I sort of covered that in earlier recordings, like earlier recordings, like 15 hours ago in my recordings. I think that came up in sort of in one of the volumes, one of the 4 volumes. The volumes actually called Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3, Volume 4. Anyway, the thing that I want to get into is what I would call the patrician aspect of the borderline. The prestige, obviously the when I say patrician, I mean like how they see themselves as high status, high class, aristocracy in some sense. They need to be powerful. I mean, they also need to be powerful for practical reasons, because otherwise they can't secure their dishonesty and their fraud, as it were. They can't easily conceal it without the unaccountability that power generally confers, or the scope, or some scope of unaccountability for them to sort of work their subterfuge with. So the thing that I'm trying to get into is essentially how that envy filter essentially creates an interesting kind of narrative that, you see, the way to justify having an envy filter requires a kind of religious worldview in some sense, or an esoteric spiritualism or something like that, or some kind of fatalism, in which there is a kind of cosmic fate on some level, because unless you abrogate epistemic responsibility on that kind of level, unless you degrade agency, epistemic agency, or agency itself, self-determinism, on that kind of level, you can't really justify having an envy filter, because envy filters are essentially trying to use a contrasting heuristic to excuse your unilateral subjective imposition of boundaries and the heuristic of the envy filter itself. So the envy filter is itself a fudge, okay? But you can only have fudge if there's somebody else who's willing to take on the role of essentially the grand fudge maker or something like that, which is, in some sense, has to be a kind of pseudo-religious, kind of contemplative model of reality. And so when people who have the same ideology, okay, this is getting more complicated, because actually what I'm talking about is more like the hybridized borderline with the ideology in some sense, which they're more histrionic than borderline, but they do sort of have an understanding of the borderline thing in some sense. So, this is already it's a very weird sort of thing, because, this is like the Nazis had this kind of culture essentially. That, essentially, because, like, for example, if you're a Nazi, right, and you believe in blood and soil, and you believe in your genes and your group, because you have to, essentially, you have to. If you don't believe in your group, then you're letting your group down, right? That's the same bullshit in identity politics. And it's like, well, then what happens actually if your group dies out, or if you're the last one, and then you have to go join some other group, then, like, how good was your culture? How good was your ethnicity? Like, in some sense, if you get really bad luck, you can't really just call it bad luck, because then like whatever it is that you're describing about the way of the world, it doesn't really support an ethos or an ethic. That then you can't have ethics. You can only have ethics if you say that, like, what happens to you deserves to happen to you, and that's why the envy becomes such a kind of competitive blood sport in some sense, that, like, if you can see some contrasting disparity, you can leverage that into a hysterical claim and expectation and sense of entitlement. So because of this idea is that, like, essentially the whole system is rigged, and therefore you need to get in on the rigged system. And in fact, the people who accept that the system is rigged in this particular way, in whatever way, in the way of identity politics, in terms of how identity should administer what goes on. Then what happens to people that essentially have the same mode of interacting with reality, but, like, sort of, they just don't get the good outcome. Like, it just doesn't, they don't get what they want, or they don't get to, they haven't they haven't won in terms of the manipulation in some sense. Like, they just weren't lucky enough. They just weren't in the right place at the right time. And in some sense, everyone is interchangeable in that sense. And they're all sort of drifting along based on some kind of destiny heuristic. So they really focus in on something like destiny, that all you can do is have the same way of interpreting reality, and then run off of some kind of supra. I'm not describing this well. Anyway, there is anyway. I mean, what I'm describing is very technical, and it's not that useful, but it is a structure that manifests. It is a facet of one of the presentations in some sense, but it's more of a cultural phenomenon than it is from the structure itself. So I guess, I'm not even just, there's not that much interesting structure to define. What's more interesting is the social manifestation of it, which is essentially this kind of patrician pecking order, this kind of status, and it's interesting because, like, some people have more power in this corrupted secondary intellectual economy. Just essentially, they have the. In fact, if you don't know that you have power based on this hierarchy or based on this system, you have the most power. That's also how power works in general. But anyway, that if you don't know that you have it, then you have so much of it, And so this happens in terms of, well, if you're so disadvantaged, and if you're so systematically oppressed because of your intersectional ranking, and you're so oppressed that you don't even know that you're oppressed because of the systemic oppression, then it's like, in fact, you have so much power that like your opinion doesn't matter, because it's like you haven't even injected yourself into the middling, sort of pecking order. You have so much power relative to how the pecking order is calibrated that you can't even be incorporated into the pecking order. So it's weird that like the pecking order really exists for what has generally been tagged as the white liberals or something like that. But I mean, they are soon not to be outdone, I believe, by the overt fascistic calcification of this form of morality in some sense. Where I mean, already you can see these things being generated within the culture, within the current contemporary political maneuvering, that it's sort of is almost testing how much derangement it can get away with, how much disorientation, how much destabilization and compartmentalization of other people's feelings that they can get away with. That essentially, there's going to be like, well, to prove that you're not racist, you have to be completely fine with, throwing your children to some, like sacrifice machine to prove that, like, that all lives have equal value, and so the systemic oppression must be atoned for in some kind of hostage-taking process or something like that. That it's actually going to be implemented. Um, I mean, essentially, what that, I mean, obviously that wouldn't happen in practice, but I mean, that's a bit of a metaphor. In some sense, it's going to be like, well, everyone will, in the same way that people tolerated Hitler taking over Poland, or a lot of people tolerated Hitler taking over Austria. Essentially, I really think that culturally in the world, uh, it would be hard for people not to speak out against a genocide in South Africa. I think almost they might get away with it, or at least it would just be labeled as an internal affair. In the same way that, like, Hitler was left to his own devices, in terms of the genocide against the Jews. Well, this is kind of a slightly different topic, I guess, but although somewhat interrelated slightly. Yeah, so it is hard to define the kind of the brittleness in this pecking hierarchy, um, in this pecking order. And in some sense, that's the kind of pecking order that women, to a large extent, have conditioned themselves to gaming, because it's safer, it's easier. It's much easier to work out that society deserves that you will be approached by handsome, rich men that want to give you nice things, as long as that you are sort of dominant over the other woman in terms of your status or your social status, or something like that. It's kind of like it's on that kind of and I'm being very vague. Yeah, I've actually, this whole topic is actually a bit embarrassing. Um, but you can kind of see the outline of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. there's a kind of cosmic fatalism that fills in the gaps of the moral spaces where the whole thing, because it's not very well reasoned at its core, just sort of fills in, is the glue that fixes the edifice. And it's interesting because there is that level of kind of arbitrary and vicious, I don't know, what did they call it? Like ideological cannibalism, when they are actually infighting amongst themselves. And in some sense, there's a level to which that can never be solved. Because let's just say the fascists took over. Let's just say Hitler took over the whole world and genocided every other country, and the only thing left were the Aryans. Well, then there's no other group in existence. So, like, what's the difference between like someone who does very well and someone who doesn't do very well? Like, if they're both Aryans, if they both come from the same identity class, you know, how do you sort of calibrate that? And in some sense, then they have to sort of, how do you keep the general theory alive and sort of account for normal things in some sense? And then they have this weird kind of internal status. And they have no way to actually vent that towards a scapegoat if they if there aren't any left. I mean, well, I guess this is, well, the clue is that they never do run out of scapegoats. They always invent more conspiracies. I mean, even when the Germans had captured all of the Jews and removed them physically from society, they were still complaining that the Jewish conspiracy lingered in the minds, in the same way that these racists complain about the colonization of the mind and the white thinking, that they just brand ideas that disrupt their unaccountable power as being themselves the product of racism and racism incarnate. And then how, you see, this is why I think that if you just left them to their own devices, obviously you can't do this politically, but if you just gave them a country and said, okay, you actually try to run a country based on your disgusting, corrupt morality, it would it would have to go to war with the world. It would have to find an enemy. It would have to find an opponent, even to keep itself alive and functioning to some degree. Because if they're stuck with this internal quandary, this internal sort of, how does status get apportioned within our own system, they have to have a very vague spiritual kind of cosmic justice, which in some sense is just not good enough. It's actually, it's laughably thin and facile. And in that sense, it's as facile as the kind of as the kind of dissonance that gets projected by narcissists. To me, it's almost like a mirror of the same, a reflection of the same kind of metaphysical issue that's obviously being expressed differently. Um, in some sense, borderlines would have an easier way of doing this, although borderlines are just so dysfunctional in terms of just their outward engagement in reality itself, in some sense, because it's just so corrosive and unsustainable on a structural level. But in some sense, borderlines would just conflate this more into the envy. It would just become another layer of a kind of the envy filter that they use, in some sense. That because in some sense, borderlines don't share their borderline with anyone else. They are their own identity. They are a an individual identity, which is also why I think that a lot of pure borderlines can't become identity politics people. I actually think that they are hybrid. I think that all these borderline cases that are being diagnosed, in some sense, I mean, look, I'll say that there's something to the diagnosis, obviously, because they're not just histrionics, but they're actually ideological hybrid, borderline histrionic cases. That the ideology itself has pierced the veil between politics and psychology. And okay, so that's, I think I've covered everything now. Yeah.